Okay, folks, half a minute to airtime. Get your places. Get to your places. Okay. I have an opening for next week. My guy canceled. Who do you have in mind? Well, we'll talk later. Ready? Okay. Hi, I'm Barry Klein. We're at another meeting of the Houston Property Rights Association, a 22-year-old weekly tradition here in Houston. We're being broadcast live by Houston Media Source, which is a cable access station funded by the government here in Houston.
It's actually funded by cable subscribers.
Funded by cable stations who are they have franchises from the government.
Right. In exchange for the use of the public utilities.
Okay, I think I stood corrected. Okay, let's get into it. Now, this is a very empty room today because we've had some traffic problems in Houston, plus it's a bad rain day. But there's an 18-wheeler apparently caught fire on one of our major freeways not far from here. I recall back in the late 70s when the ammonia truck fell off the freeway. Does anybody here recall what year that was? Was that 1977?
I'm not sure.
But around that time frame? Right.
That's the correct time.
Killed a lady driving through there.
Oh, really? Well, it might have gotten to me. I was actually driving a delivery truck in this part of town, and all of a sudden the traffic just backed up on me, and I tried every which way I could figure to get through the 610 West back to my job site, and I finally realized I just could not get through. I was in gridlock. I'd never seen it in Houston. So I finally stopped and called the boss. I said, I can't get through. And he said, well, the radio's reporting this truck fell off the freeway and blew up. And so that was a famous ammonia truck incident that fell from one section of the where 610 and 610 West and 59, known as the Southwest Freeway, intersect, and it fell off one of the ramps down to a lower level, killed several people. Of course, the fumes, the explosion killed some. I guess fumes killed more. And I still recall the sad story of two policemen who were from another city who had come into town to apply for jobs here and were close by, so they leapt out of their car to go help out, and both were badly hurt by the fumes. I don't think they ever got proper work again because they were first responders on that day, and they saved some, but they also damaged their own personal lives. So, in any event, we've got a small but a special, very select audience today for our speaker, who himself is not here because I have word that he is now also trapped in the...
10 minutes.
Okay. So he's going to, I guess, work his way through the traffic jam, but that's okay. We've got things we can talk about before Dwayne Stovall arrives. Before I get to my remarks, does anybody have any compelling announcements? How about you, Jimmy? Anything you want to spell off about?
Well, ISIS is a big issue on the news.
Right, it is.
Some people think that John McCain is connected to him because he's in a picture with one of the leaders. And, a lot of people in Iran think that ISIS is an American invention.
Well, I think that's what I'm reading too, or grew out of an earlier American invention or subsidized group. It's clear that nobody knows what's going on, including our own leadership in Washington, and they're pretending that this new government in Iraq is some kind of coalition government.
I'm glad that President Obama did not call it a religious group or a Muslim group or anything like that, but they are primarily Sunni militants. When they captured part of the Iraq army, they divided up the Shias and the Sunnis. The Sunnis could live. The Shiites were all executed.
I hadn't heard that part. I knew there were executions. I hadn't heard that.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And one of the men survived. He was a Shiite, and they lined him up to be shot. The guy next to him was shot, and blood spattered over his face. And then a bullet whizzed by his head, and he fell to the floor or the ground and pretended to be dead. And that night he crawled off to a river and hid in the reeds and found another man there that was more severely wounded than him. And they stayed there together 4 days, and then he went on. And the guy that was left behind said, "Be sure to tell the world what's going on, with the ISIS." And the ISIS is so violent, the Al Qaeda kicked them out. Al Qaeda asked them to stop being so violent, and they refused. And so Al Qaeda said, "You're out of our organization."
And I just read recently that, for a long time they thought there were only 10,000 active fighters, and now they tripled that. The CIA has now decided they're really more like 30,000.
30,000 what they're talking about now. So it's a dangerous, bloodthirsty group.
Well, so now that's a country where everybody needs the Second Amendment to protect themselves in case a bad guy comes to their home.
Barry, the Peshmerga had a lot of small arms. Now, the Peshmerga had a lot of small arms. When a 155 millimeter cannon faces small arms, you don't have any contest whatsoever.
Your point being that Peshmerga do not have...
That's right. They didn't have heavy weapons.
Okay, so they're being defeated on the
Sure
ground
they
by
were.
ISIS?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I hadn't heard that. Okay.
Well, that's why the United States intervened.
Oh, really?
The
Okay.
Peshmerga, the Kurdish Peshmerga.
Yeah, they just have guns.
Yeah, I mean, they have hunting rifles.
They don't have artillery.
Oh, I think they got more than hunting rifles,
Well,
sir.
I'm just saying, they're light weapons.
Yeah. Well, okay, we'll have to see how that works out. Let's move on to some of the local matters before our speaker arrives. John, do you have something compelling?
Well, it's just,
Compelling.
it's just that on the history of the thing, I got a real shock earlier this week. It turns out the death for blasphemy laws that are being used in whatever over there, including this woman who's Christian who's being held and going to be executed for blasphemy because she said something. Turns out those laws were British. They set them in during the colonial period, and my jaw kind of hurt when it hit the concrete when I heard that one. But the other one is that the most significant event in that part of the world for a few thousand years was when the caliphate was removed from Constantinople. Until then,
What year was that, John? You're older than most of us.
I'm running it as the end of World War I, 1917 something.
I think it
but,
fell apart, maybe a year, 1 or 2 years before that.
but the thing is, the thing fell apart, and that's been the way that the whole thing was being ruled for thousands and thousands of years, starting with a guy named Constantine, who started Constantinople, and it was called the Eastern Roman Empire.
Now, was it Constantinople or Istanbul? I can never remember. That
They
song
keep
used to help
switching
me.
the name. But anyway,
Okay.
but the thing is, when that particular thing fell apart towards the end of World War I,
Well,
that had a lot
the
to
British
do with
and the French were there to divide it up, and they drew some lines on a map.
and they didn't divide it,
Yeah.
and then they left
Yeah.
or whatever after World War II.
Okay, we're just going to pass the mic down here. This is an experiment to try the mobile mic. Steve.
I think we have another example of misplaced priorities in the city now. The authorities are talking about tearing up the historical brick streets in Freedmanstown, which the locals want to keep because it's part of their history, but they can't fix potholes or streets that are in desperate need of repair all over town. They'd rather talk about tearing up bricks.
Oh, it's also interesting about that. Hold it for a second, if you would. About that is that the city of Houston doesn't hesitate to damage or destroy historical structures, including a brick-lined street, which we have very few. And yet it's very aggressive, bringing the law to bear on people who have property in historic districts. So they are willing to damage or destroy historic structures owned by the city, but they'll be very harsh on private citizens who want to make changes to their personal property. So I guess it's a selective enforcement. I guess another example of selective enforcement is the recent story, just about 2 or 3 days ago, where the fire department has a number of buildings over on Dart Street in the First Ward, which were cited for violation of the Houston building code several years ago, and those violations are still unattended. So the city gives itself a waiver whenever it feels like. Well, it looks like our speaker has arrived. Now, why don't you sit down and let me introduce you and cover a couple of topics before we bring you up, and then we'll let you eat later. Okay, another comment, yes.
Well, I was in Fort Worth with Jimmy about 3 weeks ago, around July 13th, we went through Fort Worth, and Fort Worth has a beautiful brick street called Camp Bowie Boulevard. Doesn't seem to be working. But
for me. It's only for TV.
anyway, the brick street has been covered over with asphalt in a few places where it's worn. You can still see that beautiful brick Camp Bowie Boulevard. Probably goes back to 1900 or something. So that's one solution.
2 points. One, where they're all upset, I believe Dart Street is where they built on top of the Yellow Fever Cemetery.
That's correct. Most of that was covered over when they built the initial Jeff Davis Hospital.
Yes. The other point is that if you get out there, go out West Dallas and wander around south of the Founders Cemetery on West Dallas, you will find those bricks streets, and you will see parallel concrete grooves, lines in them. That's where the city tore out the railing of its last metro,
Okay.
where they last had carts.
There used to be, now going back to the Fourth Ward, there's Andrew Street is the one that has brick lines, as brick laid. But in the center they have the concrete patch when they took out the trackage circa 1940 at the point of the World War II when they were trying to get all the scrap metal they could.
Excuse me. I think one of the issues there is that
Use the microphone.
they're having to replace utilities at the same time they did the street.
Yeah, the defenders of the
So
bricks,
it's virtually impossible to keep the bricks in place and tunnel under all of them.
well, the defenders of the bricks say they can tunnel. Lewis?
Well, you know,
Defenders of bricks.
for the first time that I have seen the freeway, the Texas freeway or U.S. freeway, has been relined or recovered with asphalt for quite a bit, for about a mile or so there on 59. And I wonder, you know, asphalt doesn't last very long. When they repair streets in Houston with asphalt, they last 3 or 4 years, and they start to get potholes from the weather and get uneven because of the heat in the summer here. So how long do you think that's going to, will that last as long as concrete on 59?
Well, I think the answer might be that they make a choice. I recall reading about this years ago. They make a choice based on the cost of asphalt or the cost of pavement, of concrete at the time they make the decision. And that becomes a factor. And of course, it's a much quicker repair with asphalt. If they were to tear out the old concrete and put in new, we'd be out there, dealing with the repair operations for months. Steve?
2 further comments on this recent discussion. Paving with brick is very much like what the Romans did with the Appian Way and others. And some of those are still around.
Right.
Also, it is interesting to note that there is a historical display on Bel Air Boulevard just to the west of 610. The historical display is a trolley car. One of the few trolley cars around, and it was put there, when they were tearing them up. And the basic technology is exactly the same that we have nowadays with our super expensive Tunerville trolley.
Well, I can point out to you that I recall when they installed that historic streetcar, they actually had to buy it from Portugal. Because the rail line that went from Main Street to Bel Air was the very first rail line to be discontinued, circa 1926. And it was in the mid-30s that Houston Transit Company, which was called Houston Electric, decided to dismantle the entire rail component of their operations and switch to buses. And so over 4 years, through 1940, they discontinued rail and switched to a bus-only system. But the first one to go was the line going out to Bel Air. That was circa 1926. The Houston rail cars, by the way, were sold to Dallas, and then Dallas used them up through, I think, the early 50s when they finally made their decision to go to a bus-only system. And of course, all that got reversed in Houston and Dallas and other parts of the country when federal grants came in, which set up a perverse incentive to retreat on transit matters, go back to a bus and rail system, which is less efficient than bus only. Okay, Lewis.
Well, one of my memories as a very small child was riding downtown. A friend of my mother's took me downtown on a trolley, and but when I was in college, a freshman at Harvard, I lived in Wigglesworth on the Harvard Yard, which backed into Massachusetts Avenue, and there was a streetcars were on Massachusetts Avenue with electric wires overhead, and when they passed, the room I slept in and studied in would vibrate. We were on the 3rd floor, and then in the spring of that year, they replaced the rail with rubber wheels. They were still operated on by the electric wire overhead, but they were like a bus then, or at least with wheels, and it quit vibrating. And that's why I thought, when they put hard rail in, one of the bad things that was going to happen here was the vibration and the noise in adjacent structures.
Well, they managed to reduce the noise problem by having welded rail. And so no longer do you have that clack, clack, clack sound. Now, as you know, I live 2 blocks from the North Rail line here in Houston. And it's actually not a problem for me. They do have what might be like a short noise wall. There's an elevated section, not 2 blocks or maybe a block and a half from where my house is situated. And so it is not a problem. Occasionally, when I'm outside, I'll hear a horn. But what's nice about that is that the whole thing is elevated, and at night is lit up like it's a bridge across the River Seine in Paris. I feel like a very continental person as I step out onto my street and look off in the distance towards downtown. And I've got this elevated section of rail, and then a station at top, blue and white and yellow lights, make it all quite lovely. And of course, I'm in the process of moving. I'm moving to another part of the north side, so I'm going to miss that aspect of where I currently am. Even though, of course, we all know that rail was a bad policy choice for Metro. Jimmy.
Yeah, Barry, I sent you this email that showed China's new beautiful suspension bridge is 4,000 feet long. And you said that was a waste of money in China. Japan has spent too much money on infrastructure, but it's a beautiful bridge and it helps people move their cars and their trucks. Another friend said there's about 14 other bridges in the world that are actually longer than that, suspension bridges. It's an amazing bridge, and I'm surprised you were against building that.
And some of those may be in Japan, and that's how government keeps itself functioning. They keep their people employed, and they oftentimes will use debt to do it. It stalls the economy paying off that debt. They got a wonderful new piece of upgraded infrastructure, but they already had something in place that was serving that purpose beforehand. Looking at the Chinese situation, they're now cutting 29 minutes off a trip that used to be. It's it takes a minute to cross that same distance where they used to be able to, with another half hour on their trip, they could have used a tunnel, which was already in place, or a couple of tunnels and a section on surface roads. So I'm really very skeptical they need to spend all the many billions I know they spent on that, and they're not even counting that point down the road, 25, 30 years down the road, where they're going to have to sandblast the whole thing and repaint it. That's a horror story for another. It's not, but the traffic is already being served by the existing infrastructure. And the same thing with Japan. Japan has a stalled economy. It hasn't moved beyond 1995. And that's because the government officials don't want to admit their problems. They kick the can down the road. They're building lots of new infrastructure, keeping people employed. But just like in this country, they're building things that don't need to be built when there's existing infrastructure that serves the need at the moment.
They say also the Japanese are very frugal. You know, they don't want to spend a lot of money, and so
That's individuals.
They
The
say
government doesn't have
their
that same
bath
attitude.
water and all that.
And the government does not have that same attitude.
Yeah, I was going to let you know that Metro's discussing.
They use it to wash their dishes.
We've been working on extending the late hours from 8 to 11. I did get a call from the Metro board members that they're discussing extending the hours from 8 to 11, which will be affected by 1.4 million people. We've got 82 baseball games, 44 basketball, 28, 127 conventions, and it'll help downtown because most of the events get out from the theater, get out between 9:30 and 10. So I told them that it couldn't be that expensive. The only thing they opened up the HOV, that's my other thing, trying to open up all HOV lanes on weekends, free for everybody. They worked on the summer. All they did was from downtown to Galveston. But they gave no signage. And last year, we got them to start it. They had 36,000 people use it. But with no signage this year, it's half. So I talked with the director, and I was just saying, God bless, you're opening them up, but no one knows how to get on them. I said, you know, it's kind of a shock. And another thing that you might like is talk about potholes, because I created the pothole hot. 311 was my idea, created it. But what we're saying is all these management districts and these tiers, why can't they take part of that money in their area and fix the potholes that are in that area? I went before a group of different areas, and they like the idea.
Well, you know, Griff, they already have their special district. They got a TIF there and a management district, and so they got all this money in hand. It's free money. Why aren't they using it for potholes?
Exactly. That's the thing, because.
But I think what you're really pointing to is a problem that Metro has been around for over 30 years, and now they're getting around this idea that people actually work late or they're downtown late. So it's a very slow to arrive reform, and who knows how long it will last. There are examples in the past where government does something smart and then backs away from it 1 or 2 administrations later. So there's no guarantee that'll last. But right now, Metro's in a mode of trying to show that they're reimagining their whole system. So I think what you fell into is a moment in time when they're willing to accept a new idea. Let's talk a bit about the handouts we have before you. Now, as you know, talking about infrastructure, our government has told us that we need billions of dollars more to be spent annually in Texas to keep up with traffic. That's an expression I like to use, to keep up with traffic, which means population growth and growth of cars on the road system. And so we're looking at a constitutional amendment in November that'll take at least 1.4, and I've seen a number up to $1.7 billion yearly out of the rainy day fund. Half the rainy day fund will be put into TxDOT's hands. Now, TxDOT is a wastrel agency, and they hide money. 2 or 3 years ago, they found $1 billion they had overlooked. They were able to plug that into some of their current plans. And now they're giving almost $100 million to El Paso, almost $100 million to San Antonio for rail projects. They're looking at a high-speed rail going from Oklahoma City down to the South Texas. It's an agency out of control, serving the construction industry and, of course, the people who actually get these very generous salaries, which they give their top leadership. So I'm personally urging people to vote no on this constitutional amendment in November. And what I've given here, I think, is a devastating argument against that proposal. This is an article published by the Texas Tribune, which is an online publication. And a few months ago, I sent the author of this piece, Aman Batheda, some of my articles that point out that the average travel time for commuters is under half an hour in almost the entire country, and that they have arbitrary standards of need, and that the computer modeling is not reliable, and it tends to exaggerate the need for new facilities. Hold on just a minute. Well, the author of this piece is talking to one of the most famous people in the traffic world in this state, and his name is Tim. What is Tim's last name here? Tim Lomax. And Tim Lomax, in the course of this conversation, you can see it on the back side, acknowledges what many people in this room have heard from me in the past, was that when traffic becomes too irritating, too much to bear, people will make a change in their lives. They will move closer to the job site. Now, something else that happens is that when the employers find they can't recruit people because of traffic, they leave that congested part of town, typically downtown, and move out to the suburbs where they get closer to the workforce so they can actually hire people and keep them. So it's a self-limiting, self-solving problem, and it reflects what you see here on my yellow button. Yes, what do we have here? Garth.
Your attendance today, I think, is dependent upon the terrible traffic today. There's a
We've
terrible,
already, you got here late, sir.
got there.
there's a terrible
We
thing
know.
on the freeway.
Yeah, we've talked about that. You'll have to go back and watch the video to catch up.
Barry, your argument is not valid.
I'm not through making my argument. In a minute, I'll give you your opportunity.
We'll rebut it.
But I want to point out my yellow button, which talks about subjectivity and spontaneousness. And my argument is that people have a subjective reaction to traffic. Some can tolerate a long trip, some cannot. People make a decision about where they work and where they live based on that level of tolerance. And of course, they spontaneously adjust to how they perceive their traffic problems to solve those problems. And this has been pretty much ignored by the people who are in charge of transportation in Texas. But now we have Tim Lomax acknowledging that he understands what really happens when people find traffic is too irritating. They change their life in some fashion. So I'm hoping to get this important concession by a leading thinker about traffic in Texas become part of the debate before we get to the election on November 4. Taking you back to the front part of this handout, I want to point out to you an error I made. My error is one of formatting. You see there's the words, gridlock is no threat. That's my attitude. But when I put it on this handout next to part of the text from the article, I didn't realize until I finished running off 100 copies that in fact that looks like it's part of the article. It is not. So I put my little notation there to show it's not part of the article. I'll have to reformat that. But that's one of the dangers when you take something that's in the published by a newspaper or on the web and then turn it into a handout. You have to take some care to make sure that your commentary doesn't look like it's part of the initial article. But I think this is very, very valuable. He's acknowledging we have a flaw in how we can do our computer modeling, that we're not really facing 2-hour commutes. That's what the computer model may show for some point in time, 20 years in the future. In reality, people adjust to traffic so they can live with it, and that is something all taxpayers should keep in mind. Item number 2, and I need another sip of water. Hold on. Okay, this takes us back to Richmond. Now, as you know, some property rights advocates from Harris County and Fort Bend County and people living inside Richmond did a petition drive to get an election to amend the charter of Richmond. So there has to be an election on a zoning law before they put it into effect. At this point, there is no plan to do that in Richmond, a city of 12,000 population. Right next door in Rosenberg, they amended their charter in the mid-90s to require an election on zoning. That actually came up in 2008. The voters turned it down because they knew what a unpleasant situation that could be, because the zoning ordinance was written and they had 6 months to study it. Well, the city of Richmond does not want to let their voters do that, and they rejected our petition. If you look on the backside, you'll see a picture of myself getting a signature from a local citizen, and then an article about how they rejected our petition in August. Well, yesterday I was down in Richmond. Actually, I guess it was 2 days ago, and I picked up the letters that they got from the city attorney, which is a private company based in San Antonio, on why they should not accept our petition as valid. So I brought a few copies, and I have 1 or 2 extra copies to give away for those who are legal-minded. But what I see here is that the city attorneys know that they're on very shaky grounds legally. They actually put enough quotations in here from Texas law to let you conclude that. But they did get past the November election. We wanted to get that charter amendment on the November election. That's now too late for that. So it'll have to happen later, but somebody's going to have to go to court to make the city recognize that it's a valid petition, or political pressure might be brought to bear. And I'm hoping that, of course, that's cheaper than going to court. So I'm hoping to get some political pressure ginned up in the next weeks or months, so it'll end up on the May ballot or perhaps November of next year. Okay, well, let's move on to our main presentation. Dwayne, I don't really have a bio on you. I'm going to let you come up here and tell us your background. But Dwayne Stovall, I know, has a successful company in Liberty County, which is northeast of Houston. And he's got a new organization which is focused on the issue of federalism and how it's actually not being properly applied in America of today. And as I was driving over here today, I realized, take a minute to pass those out and I'll talk a bit. I realized that we can apply the idea of federalism to the state and the city level, just as he's pointing out should be lived by in terms of the relationship of the feds to states. And about a year ago, I was actually in Liberty County at a meeting I think that Dwayne helped organize, in which one of the national leaders in the free market movement, a legal expert, acknowledged that there's a difference between most cities in this country and the cities on the eastern seaboard, which had their founding before the country had its founding. And they are sort of in a special autonomous or semi-autonomous situation. But there's no reason that cities in Texas can't act like that's the case as well. If you do a petition to amend the charter that by all appearances violates Texas law or violates the federal law, the city attorney and the city secretary and the city council cannot keep that off the ballot. It's not their decision. It should go on the ballot. And if it passes, then litigation may ensue that would decide, is it legal or is it ain't? But I do think this is an opportunity as you think about amending the charters in Texas cities where we have their home rule. We got 350 in Texas. There's 3 home rule cities in Liberty County where our speaker is from. So this is something that could be imagined where cities themselves could actually try and assert authority and powers that they don't normally are thought to have. But it could be a game changer in Texas by letting locals assume more authority over their lives rather than having to live with dictates from Austin or Washington. So I give you Dwayne Stovall.
Thank you. I tell everybody up front, this is a PowerPoint presentation, so we're going to talk a lot. I'm going to try to explain to you what you will be seeing visually.
Maybe I should move some of these things for you. Put it on the screen.
Well, we don't have a screen, but I'll try to be as good a color commentator as I can.
I was just going to say, Barry, you sounded like George W. Bush when you said, is it legal or is it ain't?
Well, like George, I think his father Thanks for the colorful socks. And of course, I'm a president too, just like he was.
Before I start, how many attendees here are members of the legal profession?
Labor?
Legal.
Oh,
Just two?
Did you have to bring it up?
I kind of do. Because what I get into doesn't necessarily go against the legal profession, but it definitely takes to task the federal judiciary. My name is Dwayne Stovall. I live just north of you outside of Cleveland, Texas. I own a business called Diamond K Equipment Incorporated, where we've built bridges for the highway department for the last 15, 16 years. I also own a business called Liberty Testing. We do emissions testing in the oil field. I own compressor stations and gas lifts. A lot of what you were talking about really comes full circle with me because I've been around TxDOT for so long. What you're saying is exactly true. My biggest issue with what I'm dealing with now and what you're talking about today is who should be making the ultimate decisions about our highways. Should it be Texans or should it be someone in a town far, far away? I think we can all agree it should be us. I'll always start this out with some general questions, and they're going to sound really simple, and they are, but a lot of people, and I don't pretend to think that everybody knows what I'm talking about. Although a lot of the people in this room will, there may be something somebody picks up on that they didn't. About 8 years ago, I got into the Constitution, Philadelphia, the state ratification debates, what it created, what it gifted us with, what it was supposed to do, and what it's not supposed to do. That led me to where I'm at today. Last year, for those of you who don't know, I ran against John Cornyn for U.S. Senate. I pulled 11% of Texas on $70,000. 11% of Texas in a statewide race was significant. It's pretty phenomenal, as a matter of fact. I didn't think so because where I come from, a loss is a loss, but politically speaking and statistics, it was pretty good. I ran against John Cornyn because he's one of the biggest big government guys we've ever had. He's probably the largest, most unconstitutional government supporting U.S. Senator in my lifetime. All of that was part and parcel to why I'm standing in front of you today. After talking to over 15,000 Texans in a year, I realized so many of us don't really understand the proper relationship between the state and the federal. Now, I'm going to start this out real basic, and I want everybody to just get on board with me here. Most of the people I talk to are not well versed in the Constitution. Conservative masses of people, I would say 99% of them don't recognize what I'm talking about today. And it's tough, but that's why I'm standing in front of you today. That's what I learned over the last year. Well, I'm going to start out, which is more powerful under this Constitution, the state government or the federal government? The federal?
I'm sorry. Where do you find the word federal in the United States Constitution?
You don't.
You don't, right. It's not the federal government, it's the United States government.
Okay.
Federal is like the Federal Bureau of Investigation because it combines between the states and the national government.
They use the term federal because it was the system they chose to put it under.
But I'm objecting to your language because you're downgrading the nation to a federal government when it's not.
So it's a national government.
That's right. United States, or just call it the United States.
This is going to be a very interesting conversation.
It goes way back, federal. Federal's been used a long, long time.
I thought the states had more power until the Civil War, and then there was an amendment. What was it? Right?
14th.
Barry, the 14th Amendment, and that changed everything.
Okay. Boy, y'all are going to be right on task today. No, constitutionally, the states had the power. As a matter of fact, the federal system that was chosen by the framers is the system in which the states would hold expansive power, except for those limited enumerated delegated powers given to the general. Yes,
Can I
ma'am.
just ask you a question? Is federal, any federation or federal, any relation to Confederate?
No.
There's no connection.
I'll ask a couple other questions. Do we live in the United States of America and the free and independent state of Texas? Or do we live in the United State, singular, of America and the county of Texas?
Is the latter,
How
sir?
about both?
Well, functionally, we live in the latter. The way it was intended was the former. We don't have, the states don't manage their own affairs. The Declaration of Independence is basically useless. We're not free and independent, rightfully so. Anybody that thinks Texas manages their own affairs, even though we're looked upon as the best economy in the country, is woefully wrong. Texas, I'll give you some quick data points. In the 82nd legislature, which is the one prior, not this past one, but the one beyond that we have numbers on, we took in somewhere in the neighborhood of $82 billion in taxes. That's what we paid in as Texans. Everybody understand how much we spent in general funds, our general budget? Over $190 billion. How does that work?
In the biennial.
In the biennial. We took in $82 billion here locally, and we spent over $190 billion. How does that work?
You say locally.
Round trip dollars.
When I say locally, I mean in the state.
Round trip dollars.
Round trip dollars. That comes into the money that they take from us through our fuel and our income tax, and that's the money we get back, our FICA. That's the money they dangle back to the state legislatures every 2 years and say, hey, we'll give you a little bit of this back, but you can't feed your children fried chicken at school, and you're going to wear a seatbelt, and this is the water pressure you're going to have, and this is the light bulb you're going to choose. And by the way, don't think about praying before a football game on Friday night. That's the relationship we have with them. Well, you know, that's a dead end, because it starts at the top. With you have the Fed that creates something out of nothing and gives it to the federal government that spends 33% more than it takes in. And they're taking that borrowed money and they're transferring it downstream to states that spend anywhere from, 40, well, the state of Texas spends anywhere from 40 to 60% of their actual budget from the federal government. They get that much. So we're only taking in around half what we actually spend. The rest of it comes from the federal government, which doesn't have the money coming in to cover its budget. And it trickles all the way down to municipalities and school districts. In the state of Texas, I think we're a little over $40 billion in debt. So over 70% of that belongs to municipalities and school districts. Of the 1,024 school districts we have in the state of Texas, 75% of them are upside down in debt. But they're passing bonds for debt every single year, like nobody's business. So now I got to know.
Define upside down.
Taking in more money or spending more money than they take in. They get into debt to where they don't have a.
I mean, most of them are solid. I mean, they're
Depends on what you call solvent. I'm a school board.
They're cash solid. They're not.
No, that's not true. I'm a school board member for Tarkington Independent School District. We're in the top 25% of conservative school districts in the state. You know what that takes to be in that number? 90 days of working capital. That's all it takes. We, as a conservative school district, take in about $8.5 million. We spend about 12. That's in the top 25% of the state. What it is that as long as the state gets the borrowed money from the federal government that's getting the borrowed money, then it looks like you're solvent. If anyone in that dynamic stops getting the borrowed money, everybody becomes insolvent. So it's a vicious cycle that we live in. We have 50 different states, and Texas runs around talking about we're open for business and we've got the best economy going and we create the most jobs. Well, of the 200 and something thousand jobs we created in the last reporting period, we gave half of those to illegals. In the meantime, we're still $40 billion in debt with a higher unfunded liability number than we could ever afford in the state of Texas. In the last 10 years alone, our population's only grown by a little over 20%. In that same 10-year period, Texas debt, our debt, has grown over 150%. This is not going in the right direction. And it's being led by the federal. I'm going to throw out some real basic premise of the Constitution. The Constitution was created on 3 principles. That was it. If you can learn these 3 principles, you know everything you need to know about making judgment calls or understanding about what we need to do as a government. The 3 principles were limited government, republicanism, and federalism. Limited government's an easy one. You can interchange that with liberty. The historical fact is, the smaller a government is, the more free the people. There's never been a government in history that's ever been so large that people were so much more free. It just doesn't work that way. The larger they get, the more they oppress each other. Republicanism is another pretty simple principle. That is the principle that we're going to be represented by those we elect. And the way the framers intended it was it would be those we elect in close proximity to us, or as close as we could keep. If you read your Constitution, you'll find the original formula is still there, even though it's been amended away or changed by the Congress. And that was 30,000 citizens to the representative. That was the benchmark. So they wanted a range of around 30,000 to the representative. What we have today is around 720,000 or so to the representative. The difference between that is so huge because in the original construct, if you live in a community, they knew that if you lived in a community of around 30,000 or so, there was a pretty high likelihood that you would know the person you were voting for personally, or you would at least know someone that knew the person you were voting for. And you'd have something we don't have any of today, and that is context of character. No one has context of character of the individuals they're voting for. Very few people have personal relationships with the people that are supposedly representing us. Especially at the federal level, they get elected, they disappear. You don't know who they're eating lunch with or playing golf with. No one sees them at the store or sees them at church or at the gas station. So all we get today, instead of context of characters, we get a $5 to $10 million onslaught of ads that say they're conservative just like you. And that's what we sell it off on. The last principle is the most important, and that's the federalism. Federalism is what we discussed a minute ago. It is the principle that the states would hold expansive power. Except for those few enumerated powers offered to that new general government, the states would withhold their sovereignty and their independence and their power. When the Constitution left Philadelphia to go get debated and go through the ratification process in the states, everybody's heard of the Anti-Federalists and the Federalist Papers. Those were the documents used to try and sell what came out of Philadelphia to the members of the state delegations. People like James Madison, who everybody knows is the father of the Constitution, which is kind of funny because as smart as he was brilliant, but he was a big government founder. He was a Hamiltonian. He really wanted a lot more power in the center than he got. And most of what he put up in Philadelphia got shot down. But even though that happened, he had the principle that what they agreed upon in Philadelphia, he would allow to go to the state ratification debates and would help it and would sell it the way they agreed to it. So he didn't manipulate it. In Federalist 45, he has the most clear understanding of what the states agreed to. And that was that the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined, and those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. That's what the states agreed to. That's not what we have today. You know the amendment that no one talks about, which is the 10th Amendment, right? The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. We never talk about that, but that is federalism encompassed. That gives you the baseline of what they intended those powers to do or not do and who is going to be the final arbiter. That principle of federalism is long gone, and it's been gone for well over a century. You can go back to the Civil War, what we were talking about earlier. The Civil War was a catalyst, but it wasn't the final nail in the coffin. What we have today, instead of having a limited government based in federalism, we have a national government based in nationalism that's completely unlimited. There's absolutely nothing it can't do anytime it wants, and the states can stop it. The states can stop it, but the relationship between the states and the federal and the understanding of our state representatives about who's in charge is so disseminated into nothing, they don't realize their power, so the states just coalesce every time. Were you going to say something?
You mentioned they can do anything they want. As I recall, they passed a law prohibiting weapons around schools. And if I recall the case, well, Barry's, Lopez?
Commerce Clause, and to our surprise, 10 or 12 years ago, the Supreme Court said they could not invoke the Commerce Clause to justify that law.
Right, so the law was invalidated as a result of the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Commerce Clause.
Are there federal gun laws?
Yes.
Yes.
Does the Federal Bill of Rights protect you from the federal government making gun laws? Is it supposed to?
No,
It's kind of like
it protects you against if they're prohibiting your getting any weapons at all.
Yeah.
As I get into this, we'll get right on that. The idea that the Constitution restricts the federal government in any serious manner is a notion that doesn't exist. The idea that they would refuse to take any power or give back power doesn't exist. That ruling like you're talking about, that's similar to what they did with Hobby Lobby. They've got the Obamacare, ACA. It goes to the Supreme Court because of religious freedom, right? And they rule. How do they rule? They rule that no, it's religious freedom. We're not going to make Hobby Lobby or any other company enforce these particular aspects of abortion control, or birth control they call it, because of religious freedom. And everybody clapped. Now what's the problem with that? The ruling is we know Obamacare is national socialism on steroids, and that there is no authority in the federal Constitution for them to enforce Obamacare, to force you to purchase a good or service, or to force you to provide a good or service at a fixed price they choose. So what did they do? They gave you the Hobby Lobby ruling, and all the conservatives clapped and said religious freedom and went home. It's that give the dog a bone. So they didn't do away with the ACA. They just gave you a little bit here, and then they keep punishing you.
What about they do it under the General Welfare Clause?
That's one of them, but I'm going to talk about the three worst ones.
Okay. I don't want to.
Nationalism is the crux of the issue here. And nationalism is when all power is held in the central, with the states being utilized as subordinate administrators, for lack of a better term. That's a Hamiltonian viewpoint. And a Lincolnian viewpoint, where the states are not any more than counties. The question is, how do we become nationalized? Now, this is where, if you're in the legal profession, don't take offense, because I'm going to lay this in one area, because we can discuss all the ways we've declined over the last 200 years, and we could go into 9,000 different directions, but I think overwhelmingly, the vast majority of the responsibility falls to one single entity, and that's the federal judiciary. We can argue about administrations and really bad presidents over the years, but they come and go. We can argue about Congresses, but members of Congress come and go, and we elect those. When you talk about the federal judiciary, we're talking about unelected individuals who rule in a manner to support the growth of government in a way that they were never intended to do, and they take powers at every opportunity. I have a friend of mine who's a historian and a scholar and an attorney, and he made the comparison to the Supreme Court. He said the Supreme Court is to the President and Congress what the Egyptian army is to the latest dictator. They don't have the guns, but they do the exact same thing. They're the enforcers. They take bad behavior and they legitimize it. Well, I'll tell you, I have Jeffersonian principles, and Jefferson wasn't perfect, but most of his ideology about governance and people and local control, I stick by. And his evaluation of the new Constitution a few years after it was established was that the Constitution, y'all may have heard this, the Constitution on this hypothesis is a mere thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary, which they may twist and shape in any form they please. Well, that's exactly what happened. And the interesting case of Jefferson was he wasn't in Philadelphia, he wasn't at the state ratification debates, and he wasn't at the first Congress. This is his assessment of the finished document, and he was spot on. They had.
Let me
Go
interrupt. I forgot, I was assigned the job by the producer of this show to take this handheld mic around if you want to offer a question. So when you raise your hand, I'll bring you the mic.
Okay. For him it is.
Yeah, for him it works.
Yeah. Everybody else in the restaurant doesn't want it to work like that. There were three primary tools used by the federal judiciary over the years. The first one is the Commerce Clause. Everybody understands the Commerce Clause, like you were talking about earlier, using the Commerce Clause to invoke themselves into gun legislation. The Commerce Clause was put in place very simply to give a limited authority to the new government to help keep commerce between the states regular. That was it. It was a minor duty. It was to keep commerce between the states regular. It was never intended, never designed to allow it to do what it does today, which is to regulate all commerce in states, which is what it does. Right now today, there's nothing you wear, sit on, drive, look at that is not regulated in some way, shape, or form by the federal government. The second weapon of choice was the 17th Amendment. Now, I'm pretty sure everybody in this room is well aware of the 17th Amendment, where the state legislatures were allowed to appoint their U.S. senators at the origins of the Constitution. 1913, that wonderful year, they passed the 17th Amendment, and they took what it is a check. When they were creating the new government, they had three branches. People like George Mason said, hey, look, if you're going to have this new government, it's going to have three branches with these checks and balances built in. Then the states, who would have the expansive power, who gave the power to the new government, what it did have, they deserved a check as well. So they designed a bicameral system of Congress with two houses, one house to represent the people and one house to represent the states. And that body was supposed to be the state's check. If it were to act tyrannically or behave unconstitutionally, they were going to be able to put a wrench in it with their U.S. senators. When they did away with that control by the state and they made them popularly elected, there were a number of things that happened. We know it took away the state's check on the federal by making them popularly elected. The second thing it did was, most people don't talk about this, that it did away with the bicameral system. Instead of having 435 in the House and 100 in the Senate, now we just have a 535 member parliament. They're all popularly elected. The only difference is differing terms, and they basically work together to the same ends. If you were to graph the behavior of Congress, and especially the Senate, over the last 100 years, you'd find out that the growth of government, the growth in size and scope in government goes this way, and debt goes this way, and freedom and liberty and individual causes go this way. Yes, sir.
You're saying that our Senate and House don't really operate separately. They do operate separately.
No, if you look at the results, they basically work together.
Not all the time. Right now, they're not. The House won't pass bills that the Senate passes.
I'll put it to you this way. The Congress has the most power in government. When I say the Congress, the people's house, congressmen. There is no three equal branches of government. The Congress is the most powerful body in government. The House specifically. They don't perform their duties because they're basically congruent with the rest of the Congress. There is a worldwide wrestling federation argument going on periodically to give us drama so that we can look at the Congress and go, oh boy, the Republicans are saying this and the Democrats are saying that. Well, the problem is the historical data does not support that they don't work together, because it doesn't matter who's been in charge of the Congress or the White House. If you graft it, it's the same. They work together to do one thing. It may be different priorities for why they want it. I mean, the Republicans may want to gain more power and grow the government to dispatch freedom and democracy around the world, and the Democrats may want to grow the government and create more debt and explode the size of it and oppress everybody because they want to spread equality and democracy around the world. But ultimately, they are going the same direction.
Right now, we have the Republicans controlling the House, and the Democrats control the Senate. And the president can introduce bills and veto bills, and the Supreme Court can also say that bills are unconstitutional. So we do have those three separate powers.
except that they don't really follow the Constitution. They don't follow the Constitution, and the what's amazing is that the Congress controls so much that we argue about. They control everything. They control the size of the Supreme Court, how many courts there are. They control our dollars. They control whether we declare war or not. They control whether we impeach anybody or not. All legislative law. The Supreme Court is not supposed to be that body. They're an overseer. And the president is an executive. He's supposed to execute the will. He's not supposed to be the guy making the decisions.
There's nothing in the Constitution that authorizes the Supreme Court to declare a law elected by the representatives of the people in the Congress to be unconstitutional and therefore not a law.
There is a lot of, well, they're a quasi-legislative body now.
I think a question, Garth,
Oh,
come
yes,
back
sir.
to Lewis, but I can get the microphone back.
You talked about republicanism and the population figures per representative. So are you implying that we should have a legislature with several thousand members?
If we followed the original construct today, we'd have somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 members of Congress. I'm not saying that would work. I'm saying that as republics go, if you study Donald Livingston or Sale, Kirkpatrick Sale, or any of these folks that study a lot of republics throughout history, you find out that republics are only good to a certain scale. We're totally out of scale. Republics are made to be representative bodies. They're not made to have rulers or monarchs. So when you get to a certain size and you're distorted your representation to a certain point, you lose the federalism and the republic is gone. The sitting Congress, we talk about it in Texas, our redistricting. You know, Texans love our redistricting. We act like it's a new thing. In 1913, right in that same period, 1910, that early 20th century, they still lived by 10-year census and incoming states to modify the number of representatives in the Congress. Well, right around that period, there was going to be a large swing in population. And the sitting Congress, which was 435, number of which were worried they were going to lose their positions or have competitors, decided that 435 was plenty. That's just enough. So they passed a House rule to suspend it. And then there was an act in 1927 or 9 that solidified it, and that's where we got stuck with. That's why we have 435 today. So I'm not saying that we need 10,000 representatives, but if we would have followed the functional usage of a federal system, many things could have happened. They could have developed other layers of representation between the Congress and the people to break it down to get more coverage, or it could have simply broke up the states into smaller republics and done it that way. This nationalism that we've done, we've driven all power to the center. And that's these three aspects of the federal judiciary, what I'm talking about, these were all done to drive all power to the center, which is the polar opposite of the construct of the Constitution, which was supposed to divest power to the states, and the states were supposed to divest power through their republics. So, go ahead.
We probably disagree more on semantics than substance on some of this, but one thing I see that we would very definitely agree on is your perception that the House of Representatives was set up to represent the people directly, and the Senate was set up to represent the states.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I've heard over and over in my lifetime is that nobody ever gives up power voluntarily, and yet here we have in the 17th Amendment the states, the senators in the Senate giving up the power of their states, and then the state legislatures, presumably 3/4 of them at least approving, giving up their power. Why did they do that?
There's a lot of storyline behind that. The federal government, when you hear, everybody knows what an Article 5 convention is, right? When you hear negatives about an Article 5, and I'm not here as a proponent of an Article 5, I think it's, everybody's got their own, I'm kind of neutral on it. In 1910, 11, 12, when they were getting into this 17th Amendment issue, there were some states, not all, that had some corruption in the position of U.S. Senator in their state legislatures where they were appointing them. They had some ill dealings going on. If you'll notice, when you hear talk of Article 5, it's initiated, the negatives are initiated at the federal level. You don't hear a whole lot of state push against an Article 5. You'll always hear it from the federal level. And they use the threat of an Article 5 in a large way to tell the states, you don't want to have an Article 5 to deal with this situation with these U.S. senators. You want to just make them popularly elected and get it over with.
What is Article 5?
That's where the states make a request. 2/3 of the states make a request to the Congress that they want to have a convention to make proposals to amend the Constitution. And if they do that, I think we're within a few states of having enough to ask. They can select a delegation, come together, make proposals. If they agree on a proposal, it goes back to the state legislatures, and if 3/4 of them approve, it becomes a part of the Constitution. But that's a whole nother subject matter where they always threaten that it'll do away with the Constitution or whatever. But
I think I'll ask you a question. How do you plan to vote later this month in the Scottish referendum?
how do I plan to vote? My joke is I'm surprised the U.S. Supreme Court hasn't ruled on the Scottish. Yeah.
You know, this may be semantics, but
Go ahead.
but
You're among friends.
Actually, I am. The concept of state is a legal concept. It's a legal construct. So if a senator is representing a state, he's not actually representing a legal construct, but he's actually representing the people of the state.
In our construct, the state and the people were the same thing.
I know that's semantics.
No, it's not semantics. Lots of people don't understand that. When it says reserved to the states respectively or to the people, the language is written specifically to remind everyone that those of us that live inside the borders of Texas make up Texas. And those that live inside the borders of Oklahoma make up Oklahoma. The state is not a separate being from the people. The Texans make up Texas. There was a lot of, most of y'all realize this, there's a lot of labored thought that went into how the grammar of the Constitution was put together, because the capital S in state refers to state, as in Germany or Texas or Italy or a free state. A lowercase s is more conducive to a county structure or a precinct. It doesn't give that same, and it's funny, that particular nomination of grammar or the spelling is chosen by Supreme Court justices throughout our history to make a point. I say they make a point. The ones that were pro states' rights used a capital S in the proper tense. And some of those who were not so conducive to states' rights made a point to use lowercase when directing to a state. It was interesting. The last tool they use, and I want a show of hands, nobody has to jump up here, I'm sure my attorneys here know this. Anybody ever heard the term incorporation doctrine? This is, you make up, let's see, since January, I've done this probably 30 times. You make up about 5 times more people than have ever heard of it before, and all the hundreds of people I've spoken with, or thousands. Incorporation doctrine is a 20th century creation of the Supreme Court, in which they took the 14th Amendment, as you talked about earlier. They took the 14th Amendment and they unconstitutionally stated that it gave them the power to apply the Federal Bill of Rights onto the states. And it was created out of thin air, arbitrarily.
It was never approved before.
Well, the 14th Amendment not being ratified is a whole other discussion too. But for this discussion, we're going to say it's ratified, it's done, and what the Supreme Court did was an abomination with it.
I think we need to go over that again. Now, I do recall I've heard the term, I get to hear it and read it a lot. And so I guess you're going to have to give us some of the history on that. So the amendment was adopted, and then a later Supreme Court case came along, and they announced that it was all incorporated into the national
What
system.
I'm going to do for you is very simple. This is from legal professionals here. Don't hammer on me. I'm not a lawyer, but we're going to have a extremely low-level elementary viewpoint or study of how we got to incorporation and what it's doing to us today. Well, I'll explain all of that to you. First question is, do you believe the Federal Bill of Rights protects you from the federal government?
Partially.
It's not a trick question. It does. Do you believe the Bill of Rights and the federal Constitution protects you from your state government?
Yes.
Should it?
It's supposed to.
It absolutely should not. In any way, shape, or form, it should not.
It protects us from all governments with those particular
No.
Bill of Rights.
No.
No, he's talking about incorporation.
No, I'm talking about functionally, the Federal Bill of Rights was never intended to restrict the states in any way, shape, or form, ever. To be able to support, and people have a hard time with this, to be able to support the Constitution and limited government, republicanism, and federalism, you got to push back on the notion that the Federal Bill of Rights applies to the states. It absolutely does not.
It applies to the people in the states.
But for the relationship between the federal government and the people, yes. Not between them and their state. Yes, sir.
Could this possibly point out the reason states have their own constitution? And sometimes
You think?
their own Bill of Rights?
Boy, you're ahead of me. Yes. I walked into a room with 250 people in Fort Worth, and I said, how many constitutions are there? One. Really? One. How many bills of rights? One. Really? So those 50 individual states, those free and independent states, remember that have a constitution, and they all have their own Bill of Rights. Those don't mean anything. Well, and then an older gentleman who had not said anything, sitting at the back, said the right thing. He said, well, only one that counts. About 80 years old. I said, well, I'm not going to disagree with you, because that's where we're at today. The incorporation doctrine, I'll explain how this happened, but the incorporation doctrine centralized all governing power. It literally pushed everything to the center. We nationalized our government overnight. It obliterated state sovereignty. It turned us into those administrative units. And it made we the people subject to the whims of a few elites in a town far, far away. And I use that terminology so you get the relevance to where we were 250 years ago versus where we are today. We're in the same position. We were being ruled by those who are afar. How do you go from free and independent states to one nation? Well, the first Congress, when the framers got together and they created the Constitution, there were 70 delegates who were chosen. Only 55 actually went to Philadelphia, and of the 55 that went, there were only 39 that signed off on it. Men like Elvers Jerry, George Mason, Randolph, Patrick Henry would not touch it. They wouldn't touch it. Our kids today, and I sit on the school board, I see it. Our kids today think that they made the Constitution and there were fireworks and everybody was happy and they got this great new government. That wasn't anything close. 8 or 9 of our framers wouldn't have anything to do with it, but they did have principles. So they said, if we're going to do this, they'll help. They'll help you take it through the process at the state ratification debates on one condition. And that condition was that the first order of business, should it get ratified, is that they put further constraints on it. So it barely ratified, even with people like Patrick Henry getting on his high horse and talking about what an abomination this government would take over the states, is what he said. We didn't listen to him, obviously. Even though that happened, it barely ratified. The very first order of business was to put further constraints on it. They followed through. And that further constraints was the first 10 amendments. That was the Bill of Rights. The preamble, this has been a bit concerning for me for a while. You and I haven't talked about this. The legal description of the Bill of Rights is the preamble to the Bill of Rights. That's a statement from the first Congress. They described what it was. It's a legally binding document. It's no different than any other summary that's given in a contract. I was at a meeting in Lindale, Texas, doing a Keep Texas Free presentation, which, by the way, I told y'all this is usually I've got a big screen and we do a big PowerPoint, so you don't have to just listen to me bark. A woman at the meeting, we were talking about the preamble to the Bill of Rights, and she held up her pocket constitution, because we all have them, right? And she said, well, I'm looking at my pocket constitution, and I don't have a copy of the preamble to the Bill of Rights. I said, really? And I pulled mine out, and mine was there, someone else was there. I said, let me see that. And I took it, and it was a Heritage Foundation. And I said, you got this from the Heritage? And she said, yes. And I said, wow. So I emailed a friend of mine who works for Heritage. I said, look, no worries. I'm just curious. Why would Heritage put out a pocket constitution without the preamble to the Bill of Rights in it? He came back with a dissertation on they were ratified one at a time, this, that, and the other. Long story, that they didn't feel it necessary. So I messaged him back and I said, this is a problem, because that dictates the meaning of everything in the Bill of Rights, the usage. Well, turns out we have some what I call incorporationists in Heritage who believe the Supreme Court should be able to apply the Federal Bill of Rights to the states. We're all going to be in agreement that shouldn't happen here in just a minute. The legal description of the document is this: the conventions of a number of the states having at the time of their adopting the Constitution expressed a desire, in order to prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers, not their own, that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added. The last sentence in the preamble is just as important, because people lose context. These people had just fought a bloody war, bloody revolution. They had been oppressed. They had a king far, far away who was trying to get into their business. They went to a bloody revolution over what amounted to a less than 2% tax. If they came back today, they would shame us all to pieces for being servants to a government. But that said, these people were nervous. They were very nervous about giving power to a new government that may oppress them. So it barely ratified. The last line in the preamble to the Bill of Rights says, and as extending the ground of public confidence in the government will best ensure the beneficent ends of its institution. Its, not their own. So when it says, Congress shall make no law establishing a religion, and states like Massachusetts and Connecticut agreed, Connecticut charging state tax for Puritanism for decades, they didn't agree to give up their own power. They were restricting the authority of the new government to stay out of Puritanism in their state. That's the basic premise of the Bill of Rights. Now, this data point I'm going to tell you now is why I'm standing in front of you today. The Supreme Court basically upheld that understanding of the Bill of Rights for over 135 years. It ticks me off that I'm standing in front of you today, and we have and you can call it anything you want, but it's the progressive era. The progressive era started around 1910, basically, legally, and they are the ones that unhinged everything off the Constitution as fast as they could, and they've done a very good job of it.
Was it 1910 or 1860s?
Oh, Lincoln. That's a whole destructive, constitutionally abandoning moment in our history of itself. Dealing with judges and this decline into nationalism, early 20th century really became their marketplace. They really took over. There are going to be 3 cases we're going to talk about. I'm going to bore you lawyers to death.
You probably have only about 7 or 8 minutes.
7 or 8, I'll get you through quick. Barron v. Baltimore. It's the reason I'm telling you this is it's sequencing, so you know how you got here. 1833, before the 14th Amendment. Barron versus Baltimore. This man had a business. It was impeded on by the city of Baltimore. He sued. They granted him a $4,500 judgment. Their appellate court overturned it. He pushed it into the federal judiciary. He tried to use the 5th Amendment in the federal Constitution to defend himself or to carry the case. The 5th Amendment says it's a protection against taking public property for the government taking public property for private use without proper compensation. Am I knowing that right? The ruling by that Supreme Court justice was that the Constitution, the federal Constitution, was ordained and established by the people of the United States for themselves, for their own government, not for the government of the individual states. And they kicked it out because it wasn't under their jurisdiction. He was suing their state could handle it. That's before the 14th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment, everything that's destroyed us falls under the first section of the 14th Amendment. And that's the one that uses, no state shall make or enforce any law that shall abridge the privileges or immunities, now deprive life, liberty, or property without due process. Those words have been distorted to the point where we've lost all state sovereignty whatsoever. That was in 1868.
67, wasn't
1868 was it, and what it did.
Never approved.
Well, I don't think it was either, but that's neither here nor there now.
Approved it, but it wasn't approved by the state legislature.
Well, actually, it was used as a tool against the southern states that you're going to approve this before we let you back in.
That's right.
Which is another issue because Lincoln said they never got out, but his Congress said that they did. You can't get in. Anyway, the 14th Amendment in no way conveyed the power to the federal government to apply the Federal Bill of Rights on the states. None. 1873, you have the slaughterhouse cases. That's after the 14th Amendment. Okay. These are processors and butchers that were working upstream of New Orleans during a period in time when New Orleans had really high rates of sickness and illness for some reason that might have been, connected to the carcasses and entrails that were coming down the river. Right. So the state of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans got together. They picked up a piece of property on the south end, on the downstream side, and they told all the processors and butchers, you're going to have to move there if you want to do business. And they sued. It ended up going to the Supreme Court, and they tried to use the 14th Amendment to use its due process, all of it, due process, privileges and immunities. And the ruling by the Supreme Court then was that if they agreed with the notion of the butchers, that the effect is to fetter and degrade the state governments by subjecting them to the control of Congress and the exercise of powers heretofore universally conceded to them. Meaning, if we agree with what you're saying, we're going to give all the power the states have to the federal. What they said was, we are convinced that no such results were intended by the Congress which proposed these amendments, nor by the legislatures of the states which ratified them. And they kicked it. Now fast forward to the beginning of the Progressive era, you got a Gitlow versus New York case in 1925. Gitlow was a socialist. He wrote and published socialist doctrine, that's it. But he was arrested by the state of New York, and that case went into the Supreme Court, where he tried to use the First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And instead of it going there and the Supreme Court saying, well, we're restricted by the Bill of Rights, we're not supposed to have anything to do with that, they said, oh yeah, we'll listen to it. So they took it up, and this is the excerpt from their ruling. This is 57 years after the slaughterhouse cases and 135 years after the Bill of Rights was implemented. For present purposes, we may and do assume, and he did use the word assume, that the rights of freedom of speech and freedom of the press were among the fundamental personal rights and liberties protected by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment from impairment by the states. You can't see this, but it's lowercase s on his states. Yes, sir.
What's the name of your school district?
Tarkington.
Do you allow corporal punishment up there?
Sure.
That's child abuse, and child abuse is against the law.
Well, it depends on whether your parents say it's okay or not.
Not really. Child abuse is against the law. Anything that leaves bruises on kids' buttocks is
Bruises?
child abuse. 31 states have put away the paddle, so it's time for Tarkington. You, on the school board, should be arrested for child abuse if you allow that to go on.
Ignore it.
If my son does what some of these children do, somebody's putting wood on him.
Okay.
Can I just ask you one thing?
Sure.
You mentioned Elbridge Gerry. I guess you know what he's famous for.
What he's famous to me for, or what he's famous to you
Well,
for?
I heard his explanation. That's the origin of gerrymandering.
Of gerrymandering?
He
Why have I heard that before?
He actually was the first one to come up with, redistricting. And
He was the governor of New York, I think.
Oh, I wouldn't doubt that. I wouldn't doubt that. He's also the one, you heard the term anti-federalist and federalist. You know they were opposite. Federalists were for big government, anti-federalists for small government. He's the one who said they should have used the terms rats and anti-rats at the first Congress.
Have you finished your argument?
I'll wrap this up. Basically, where we have gotten with this nationalism of everything is we've gotten to a point now where whether Texans or the members or citizens of another state, doesn't matter. Whether you want to do things like place God or Scripture or the Ten Commandments in a public building, whether or not you want to make it a crime to burn a Texas flag or a U.S. flag, recognize marriage between one man or one woman or don't recognize it at all, or decide pornography as art and not free speech, or criminalize abortion as a choice of birth control, decide not to pay for the education of illegals, manage the bearing of arms as they see fit. All of that is a state's right that has been taken over by the federal government. So today we can't make decisions based on our morals, principles, and values as Texans or any other citizen of any other state. Those states can't do the same. Everything we do today has a caveat built into it that we'll get sued. And just in case you're wondering, states go to the Supreme Court to lose. They don't go to the Supreme Court to win. It's a biased court, to say the least.
Say that again. They go to the Supreme Court to lose. They want to lose.
Oh no, I like Greg Abbott, but I have an issue with the fact that his one weapon is I'll sue. When the fact is, you go to court, states go to court and go to the Supreme Court to lose.
Because
It's set up that way. The job of the Supreme Court today is to ensure that the behavior of the federal government or the national government stays legitimized.
That's right. The Constitution say they want to make sure all the laws are constitutional. That's what they do. They rule.
Supposed to do. They're supposed to judge whether it falls into. But see, their power is only pursuant. It's only pursuant to the authorities in the federal Constitution. It's not everything. It's just those enumerated powers.
Oh, hold on. I was going to give you the microphone.
Sir?
When they ruled that a law passed by the elected representatives of the people in the Congress is unconstitutional, they have no authority to do that in the Constitution. Show me where it's in the Constitution.
Well, when you've got a body of Harvard and Yale law grads who get together and decide that by your not participating in commerce, you are affecting commerce, so they can rule over you.
That's a 1942 case.
Yeah, that's Wicker.
We got to move quickly.
Go ahead.
Quickly.
I'd like to point out that, in my opinion, there is even a partially modern tradition of creating entire federal government departments that are unconstitutional. For instance, the Department of Education, the Department of Energy.
Well, you can take a vegetable soup and throw it against the wall. You're going to get the majority of the agencies that are unconstitutional.
We are out of time. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week. I've lost my speaker, but I'll probably find somebody exciting. See you in a week. And thanks very much, Dwayne. Great presentation.
Waiting for him to come back.
I'll come back to that.
Maybe you should come back.
Yeah, I think he should come back and finish it.
Answer.
There's more to
I
it.
think I've tried to get him and I got ignored, but maybe I can try again. You've got his number in your pocket? No, does he respond to your phone call? I guess when you get arrested, then you can call.
Gotta have money. Gotta have money.
Well, very low turnout. It'll probably be double this next week without the rain or the truck accident on the highway. Yeah. You are our guest.
I don't have one on me.
It depends. I've got people leaning on me real hard to get my state representative. Oh yeah, well, it's 2 years away. There's no sense in available for another 4 years.
Did you run in the primary? Is that it? Wasn't there a Federalist political party?
Oh yeah.
Insurance defense litigation.
Federalism.
What happened to the Federalist party?
Yeah, I have to weeks.
They what?
Same thing happened in a week. They just
Right there on Woodway and Voss.
They kind of, at least kind of turned Republican.
They wanted each other all the way across. If you go back to the list of presidents, I guess the mergers of the party names, the Democrat, Federalist, I mean, they mixed the names over, that's what they refer to themselves as.
The Whigs, they always kind of intrigue me.
You look really familiar. Not back there, I was there. I was there when Norman Adams was giving his name.
Are you a Packer? Wayne, are you a Packer?
Road pricing.
Yeah, get rid of, you talk about all those taxes.
A what? Better to have it.